start. Thanks everyone for coming here today. I think for most of you it's already the third time, so it's already a great thing. And I just give you a brief introduction of myself, and then I will go directly to the lecture of today, which is about GCC. I will speak for a while, and then happy to take any questions that you have. So you had the first two speakers. The first one, who is our chairman, he comes, of course, from the government. The second was a professor, a scholar. So I come mainly from the business, trade, entrepreneurship side. I work for American banks like Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs. I was private banking, asset management, and then private equity. Then I worked many years in the Middle East for the Qatar Sovereign Fund. So my experience is mainly on the private equity side and also a bit of VC investments, something in North America, mainly in Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. So this will be my perspective of today. The things that I know, it's mainly things that I experienced and lived when I was in Middle East. Very happy to go into the details, to give examples, to share stories, experience. I remember last year there was a guy who even asked me about the real estate in Dubai. So happy to take a question that are not directly related to the lecture. That's absolutely fine, you know. Last year I had questions about advice on career and everything. So very happy to do that and to share what I've done. So anyway, today about GCC. I will make an introduction, a bit of history, trying to explain the broader context, and then go into more the details of the countries and what is happening today in the GCC. I mean, I was just discussing with James that there is always the action in the Middle East, so there are always things happening there, but unfortunately most of the time are not good. So anyway, so it was in the 70s that the discussion to create the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, started. And interesting enough, at the beginning of the conversations, Iran and Iraq were involved. And then the Iranian Revolution in 1979, of course, changed the plan. And changed the plan by excluding Iran and Iraq, number one, and number two, by accelerating the discussion so that, just 2 years later, 1981, the GCC was created. Initially, the people were thinking to have economy as the priority. But in the end, was security, which became the main factor to keep the GCC member united, and we can see that since the beginning, because in the 80s there was the Iran-Iraq war. In 1984, the GCC created the Peninsula Shield Force, which is a 10,000 army to protect the GCC members. And it was never used until 2011, when troops, mainly from Saudi Arabia with the support of Emirates, were deployed in Bahrain in order to support King Khalifa, because at that time there was a domestic uprising. So the troops entered Bahrain and they stopped the domestic uprising. So as I mentioned, the economy was declared a priority. Security in the end became the priority. So what happened from economic point of view? Not much. It took decades to negotiate a custom union, which was implemented in 2015. Many times, people discuss about creating a currency union. I remember even when I was living in the Gulf, having meetings with the central banks. Every time, currency appreciates, they depreciate. They wanted to create a currency union, but of course, this never happened. Even though, if you think all the currencies except the Kuwaiti dinar, which is pegged to a basket of currencies. So all the currencies are pegged to the US dollar. So technically, it will be even easier if you want to do that. Then, always talking about on the economic side, still there is a limited infrastructure to connect the GCC. I was part, for example, of the team that created Qatar Railways. And the idea was to create a metro system in Doha and eventually expand the train to connect with Emirates, Saudi, and so on. But of course, this never happened, and it's unlikely to happen anytime soon now. The VAT, there was a project to implement the VAT in all the GCC countries. What happens is that this year, 2008, it was implemented only in Saudi and Emirates. Qatar, Kuwait, and the others delayed, and maybe it will happen in 2019. Of course, the crisis in GCC affected the plan of implementation of the VAT. So always talking about the economy, if we look at the GCC countries, they have similar economic models. That's the general assumption. We can go more into the details later, but in general, how does it work in these countries? You have the revenues coming from oil and gas, especially in the case of Qatar. The other countries, they have mainly oil. So the revenues flow into the state, and this money is used to, of course, pay for the state expenses for the budget, and then it's invested into infrastructure real estate project with the aim to redistribute wealth among the people, feed the patronage networks, enhance the business environment, improve the quality of the life of the people. So these are the goals why infrastructure projects are implemented there. So what do they build? They build mainly roads, buildings, power supply, transportation, schools, hospital, telecommunication. So these are the main projects. What is left? Then it goes mainly to the central banks and to the sovereign fund. Why these two entities? The central banks has the goal to stabilize once when you have macroeconomic shocks due, for example, to the oil prices going down. And money also goes to the sovereign funds with let's say two main goals, I would say. Number one is to create wealth for the future generations when natural resources will be finished. And number two, to project soft power. Happy to discuss later this one if it's not clear. So what's the limit of this model? The limit of this model is, of course, that here it's dependent on the price of oil. So if the oil goes up, things go well. If the oil goes down, things are not so well. Just to give you an insight, there are different estimates of how much should be the break-even price in the GCC countries. I mean, it's almost impossible to calculate this break-even price because you need to know a lot of data which are never accurate and so on. But I always rely to a friend of mine, and who is a banker, and he tells me, for me, 80 is always is the price at which I started to receive inflows. So you can consider 80 as $80, of course, per barrel, the oil price at which GCC countries start to generate money. So that's on the GCC. If we look at the history of the region in the last 2 decades, what do we have? We have important events that impacted the region. Of course, the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. So, what happened after these invasions? The Americans realized that, there were too many resources committed for these wars with gains that were not clearly visible. Number one. Number two, they realized they were too overstretched. And number three, other threats like the rise of China and Russia were becoming more important for the Americans. The fact that Americans were so engaged in the Middle East also allowed Russia and China to project more power globally and to rise during the years. So what the Americans have decided to do was to change strategy. So from active involvement in the region to maintain a balance of power in the region. Or, if you want, you can also say that moving from control on the ground to denial of control of others, always on the ground. So when we talk about balance of power, we mean that you will have different states, different powers trying to balance each other with no one which is emerging and having a dominant influence in the region. Of course, that's very easy to say, but very difficult to implement. But this implies that Americans need to have a relationship with everyone. So how do you implement this strategy? Was implemented in different ways. Number one, they started to withdraw from Iraq, and this was completed in 2011. Then they started to negotiate an agreement with Iran, because, as mentioned, if you want to maintain a balance of power, Iran, of course, is a big power in the region, so you need to maintain a relationship even with Iran to counter the other powers. And this agreement, this negotiation ended with what is called the JCPOA agreement, signed in 2015. So these were important steps that the Americans took in order to create this balance of powers. Of course, not everyone was happy, especially on the Sunni side, because then you had an arc influence, in this case from Iran, going from Tehran to Baghdad, Damascus, and Lebanon. Of course, not directly controlled, but controlled indirectly through proxies, militias, political parties, and so on, but still a high amount of influence, and the Sunni powers like Saudi Arabia, of course, were not very, very happy for that. So this agreement then lasted only 3 years, as we know, because now sanctions with the new US administration, sanctions to Iran are back, and the reason is because in the view of Americans, it's not just a matter of nuclear weapons, it's also a matter of influence in the region, and the current US administration view is that Iran has too much influence in the region, so this influence needs to be cut. So that's one point. The other important point, talking about the history of the past in the region, is that as we know, in December 2010, a street vendor in Tunisia decided to set themselves on fire to protest against the government, and this was the trigger of different protests that gathered momentum from North Africa to Middle East. The result is that people like Ben Ali, Mubarak, and so on lost the power. The protest spread into different countries, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, Yemen, and so on. And in January 2011, Foreign Policy magazine used for the first time the words Arab Spring. So the consensus at that time was that these protests eventually would lead to democratic countries, to democratic system of governance in these countries, but the opposite happened. So today, what we know is that there is a vacuum of power, and there is chaos, unrest, violence in most of these countries. And we can see it in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. So that's the result. So the problem is that now you have. You still have the borders, but it's difficult to talk about countries where someone thinks about the situation in Libya or Yemen, for example, which basically are now failed state. And probably, not probably, but for sure they're not countries. Yet the situation in Iraq and Syria has changed in the last few years, last 2 years I would say, where Daesh eventually lost control of the territory, and Bashar al-Assad and the government of Iraq regained control, but still these are very divided countries. There are big, there's still a lot of chaos, violence, and so on. And if there are no civil wars, other countries are always in difficult position. If we think, for example, to Lebanon, which is always very divided and deadlocked, Egypt, where the economic situation is improving, but still there are many problems at the economic financial level and also the security level, especially on the Sinai. Then you have Jordan, which received a lot of refugees from Syria, and it's not easy to manage thousands of people who come from a war zone. So in this context, so we talk about the history of GCC. We saw what happened in the last 20 years in the broad region from North Africa to Middle East. So in this context, we have 4 powers that are essentially fighting to maintain and increase influence in the region. And these 4 powers are Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So if we look at Iran, as we mentioned, Iran can enjoy a sphere of influence that goes from Beirut to Tehran, as we mentioned before. Of course, it's not direct, it's indirect through proxies and so on, but still they have this arc of influence, and they will fight very hard in order to maintain that, because their point of view is that if they don't have this buffer, especially Iraq, other powers, in this case, Sunni powers can be either Turkey or Saudi, they will try to project more power and eventually come to Iran. Then we have Israel. Israel was enjoying a very strong position until recently. The reason is because the region is highly fragmented. His enemies were busy in fighting against each other. So Israel, what it did was just to observe what was happening in their neighbors. The problem is that so the situation today is not as before, and now they have Iranian soldiers very close to the border. They have a strong Hezbollah presence in Lebanon, still problems in Gaza. So the strategic position of Israel is very, very difficult at the moment. How they manage the situation They're trying to fix the Palestinian problem first, strike Iran in Syria, and eventually go to Lebanon. Because the problem is that Hezbollah was already a powerful force, having fought many years in Syria. Of course, these guys, they lost people, but they became even more powerful because they gained training, experience in very difficult war zones. They worked very close with Iranians, with the Russians. So it's even more powerful force today. Saudi Arabia, I mean, a lot in the news in the last few days, as we know. What's the problem of Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia is facing many challenges today. The volatility of the oil prices. It's a smaller country if compared to Turkey or Iran. They have a consolidation of power which is going on at the moment, and with Mohammed bin Salman, which was probably until 2 weeks ago very much in power, but now we don't know what is going to happen. In any case, it's instability. They have the Americans as a protector, but the Americans are becoming less engaged in the region, so this creates, of course, a bit of panic. The reason why the Americans historically have been the protector in Saudi Arabia is because the deal was very easy. So Saudi Arabia was providing oil to US in exchange of security, and this allowed the different kings in Saudi Arabia not to have a powerful military force, because of course they didn't want military generals to take the power or try to do a coup d'etat, like happened in many other countries like Egypt and Turkey and so on in the last few decades. So this was the deal with the Americans. Then we have Turkey. Turkey observes what is happening in the north and in the south. So it's both places are fragmenting. So this, of course, creates concerns, but also creates opportunities to project more power in the places that were part of the Ottoman Empire, Empire in the past. They also see. They also have to fix a lot of economic, financial problems, as we know. But probably is the power that will emerge and become the dominant power in the coming, let's say, maybe 10, 20 years. Dominant power in the region, I mean. So if this is the situation in general, so what's the position of the GCC? So as mentioned, GCC today face different challenges. The Americans, which were historically the protector, so providing security, are less engaged in Middle East. Then you have radical Islam groups like Daesh, which pose both security and ideological threats. Then they see chaos and violence and going from North Africa to different countries in Middle East, and the volatility of oil price. So very difficult position. The country that probably understood in advance what was happening, it's Emirates. And that's why they started to invest a lot in security by providing more training to their soldiers and to start to utilize foreign companies like Academy of Eric Prince to build a mercenary force. And so far, the military in Emirates is the one that has the best reputation in the region. So these threats, until recently, kept the GCC members united, but there are differences among them at the economic, political, social level. So if we think to the economics, most of the countries they try to. No, most, all the countries, they try to diversify from oil and gas, but what happens is that, they in the end compete with the same diversification strategies. So all the countries, for example, they want to develop the petrochemical sector, because of course, today there is more value in selling petrochemical than not oil directly. They also want to develop retail, tourism, the sport, the airline, the logistics sectors. So in the end, or the financial services. So two problems. Number one, they compete with the same diversification strategies, as I mentioned. Number two is the fact that today, and now is not just a problem of the GCC, it's a problem of many places in the world, is that in the past you had economic growth and job creation coming from sectors like construction, real estate, retail, logistics, banking, all these sectors. The problem is that all these sectors today are facing structural challenges or external challenges like trade wars and so on. So it's difficult that these sectors in the future will create jobs and will create economic growth. So everyone now is thinking about tech and attracting startups. So what's the problem of startups? The most advanced country from a tech point of view in Middle East and probably in the world is Israel. If we look at the economy of Israel, 10% of the economy is tech, where the productivity is very high. But startups, number one, they create too many jobs. Jobs are unstable, and number three, they create millionaires and not jobs. Just to give you a number, there was an Israeli company called Mobileye. It was sold for $15 billion with 500 employees. So not many people, and worth $15 billion. In the past and still today, $15 billion, I mean, you had 1,000 of employees. There was even an article, like another example, there was an article about the quotation of Uber next year, and bankers from Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and so on, they wanted to sell the company under 20 billion, which is the capitalization of Ford, General Motors, Chrysler. I mean, so many companies. You need so many companies to reach these under 20 billions, and thousands of people. Why? The new companies today, they don't create too many jobs, and that's a problem for the governments. So that's on the economy. On the social side, I mean, of course, the GCC citizens share similarities in terms of culture, religion, language, roots, families, and so on. But what happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that the governments in GCC now, they are trying to create new identities where people first are Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris, and then Sunni and so on. While in the past was the opposite. So this push from the governments to differentiate and create these identity which are needed in order to create loyalties to the different kings, princes, sheikhs, and so on. From a political point of view, there are, of course, different reasons, and these will bring us to the GCC crisis. So, if we look at Qatar, Qatar has a very close and deep relationship with Turkey, and together they support we can call in general groups close to Muslim Brotherhood type of ideology. And Qatar is also very close to Iran. And on the other side, you have countries like Emirates and Saudi, which have an opposite view. They actually think that Muslim Brothers are a big threat for the region, and such they need to eliminate this threat. They prefer more autocratic and autocratic type of governments, and all these countries compete for influence in other countries in the region in order to support the groups that are close to them. Then we have other two countries which are more neutral, but it will become more and more difficult for them to stay neutral, and these are Kuwait and Oman. Kuwait historically has been neutral, especially because there is a 20% Shia minority in the country. So of course they need to consider that. Oman has been historically close to Iran for trade, economic relationship, and they always maintain this policy of neutrality. Then you have Bahrain, which is struggling from economic and financial point of view, and essentially is protected by Saudi and the Emirates. In terms of security, I mean, we touched before. The problems of the countries. The additional problem is that, as we mentioned, GCC, they need to rely on external powers for security, while their main counterpart enemy, Iran, is the only country in the region that has managed to build a strong military power with their own forces and by supporting other militias and groups in the region. So, we talk about these differences, and these differences, in the end, culminated with the crisis that started in June of 2017, when 4 countries, Saudi, Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, decided to impose sanctions on travel and movement of goods to Qatar. Of course, this was mainly led by Saudi and Emirates. Egypt and Bahrain, since they are financially supported by them, joined this country in this travel and trade ban. So, by imposing these sanctions, the impact on Qatar was at different levels. Of course, the trade disruption, lower confidence, tighter financial condition. Of course, because the port in Dubai, Jebel Ali, is the transshipment port of the region, meaning that most of the things arrive then and then are dispatched into the different countries, and the countries there, they have to import most of the things, especially food. So if you close this channel, you need to find a new channel. You'll be able to find a new channel. Qatar was able to find a new channel. What's the problem? The problem that it's much more expensive, and you have to pay a cost for that, and that's why the inflation, if you go to Doha, has increased a lot in the last 12, 18 months. I can go deeper into the details if someone is curious about that, what the government of Qatar did and so on. So the reaction of Qatar was at different levels. Important level, of course, was the media, and Qatar exposed through different leaks what the Saudi and Emirates were doing. And this was also thanks to the power of Al Jazeera and other PR companies that Qatar engaged. So the question is why this happened in June and not in another time, and so which are the reasons behind. So we touched before we talk about the policies of Qatar, which are independent. They started to become independent from Saudi and Emirates in the last 20 years, when Sheikh Hamad in 95 took the power, and they became close to groups that are adverse to Saudi and Emirates, like Muslim Brothers and so on. So why? So how Qatar could do that? Qatar could do that because they have a small population. They essentially have small minorities, a centralized state, and this allows the government to control any tension that might arise at the ethno-religious level. Reason number one. Reason number two, Doha has gas, not oil, and this gives two things. Number one, money. Now, number two, you are independent from the others because the others sell oil, so you don't have to rely on them. And Qatar is the only gas player in the region. Then the geographic position of Qatar. Qatar is between Saudi and Iran, and the biggest gas reserve in the world is shared with Iran. So by definition, you need to maintain a working relationship with Iran if you want to continue to extract the gas, which is essentially your source of income and the way to survive for you. So, as mentioned, Qatar has maintained a pragmatic relationship with Iran, supports Islamist groups which are adverse to Saudi and Emirates. This has been going on for years until the point where Saudi and Emirates thought that this was enough, and they took advantage of a window of opportunity that opened with the new US government. So. They thought maybe this would not last long, so they had to act very fast and implement all these policies against Qatar in order to insulate it. So today, so what are the different positions after 1 year and a half? It's clear that US has not an intention to solve this crisis very fast. That they tried at the beginning, but not much has happened. Qatar position, they show high resilience. This is mainly thanks to the efficiency of the government in this case and the massive resources that accumulate in the last few years. So they, of course, managed to survive. They found a new way to continue, and they think that, by maintaining a relationship with certain countries in Europe, like Germany and Italy, a working relationship with Turkey, Iran, and the US, this could allow them to survive in the long term. But of course, they always try to fix the situation, because from economic financial point of view, it's always a big cost for them. So we said the US, we said Qatar. So what's the position of the quartet? Saudi and Emirates. I mean, they don't have an intention to stop anytime soon. For them, there is no an incredible cost, apart some cost they had on the reputation side, but was not that much. And they don't want to end this one anytime soon. So consider that these are the position. Unless something massive happens, it's unlikely that anytime soon the situation will go back as before. And even in case today we have an announcement and people say, okay, sanctions have been lifted, the situation will not go back as before. The reason is because now the trust is lost, and it will take many years to reestablish trust relationship. So even though from a legal point of view you can go back to the previous situation, it's unlikely that on a daily basis it will happen. So and now I will conclude and stop because I already spoke too much. We started by saying that the Iranian Revolution in '79 speed up the process to create the GCC. Now the emergence of Iran is creating big fault lines among the GCC. And what is happening today in GCC is that you start to have instead of a consensus as before, more bilateral relationship, and then you have, of course, Saudi with Emirates, Qatar with Oman, Kuwait with which is in the middle, and ironically enough, Arab powers like Saudi and Emirates are funding today very close to Israel for the simple reason that their interests are now shared. And these interests are mainly to counter the influence of Iran in the region. I stop here. Very happy to take any question now. Thank you.